didn't have the opportunity to find out. I've had a few experiences. The first was driving to my friend's ranch for a New Year's Eve party. This was down in Eagles Pass near the Texas-Mexico border. It was pouring rain and I was creeping down a back road with my high beams on. Something jumped in front of my truck, stopped for a second, and then darted back into the woods. It was about 3 feet tall, white, and briefly stood on 2 legs. I'm pretty sure Gollum lives in South Texas, and it freaked me the hell out. The second, an abandoned and torn up tent in the outback of Australia. On our road trip up the west coast, we took a little detour inland near Carnarvon to see the red sands and such. We went down a dirt road with nothing for miles, and we found a tent. We hesitantly approached it and saw that it had been torn open on the side. There was a filthy pillow and some scattered clothes inside, but it was still firmly stalked down. Looked like it had been there a while. The final one was back in Texas, out near Enchanted Rock. Walking around the woods with some friends when they stumbled into a pit full of rattlesnakes. I don't know if you've ever seen a snake den, but they tend to ball up into a horrifying Lovecraftian nightmare. I am from Alaska. I was born into the Togateli tribe in the center of Alaska in 1980. This is about 50 miles south of Fairbanks, in a small town called Nenana. There are several other tribes in the immediate area, and long ago there were far more before Russian and American settlement. I don't want to identify myself on accident, in case anyone from here ends up hearing this, but suffice to say that paranormal experiences are natural and expected as part of my ancestral heritage. As a child, my grandparents told my father strange stories of the stickmen, who were eaters of men. They especially loved the flesh of children, and newborn babies were considered delicacies by these spirits of the forest. One time when Nenana was first being settled by Gusok, white people, there was a hunter who came from faraway lands to settle the wilderness of Alaska and hunt its bears and moose. He took a small party of hunters and native guides into the forest, deep into the countryside to the marshes, where moose and bear frequented. Far down the Tatana they went, shooting every animal they saw: squirrel, moose, wolf, porcupine. The natives were silent and led the men on, afraid to question their violent, wasteful ways. Until late one evening, the hunter called his party to set up camp and rest. They chose a quiet spot in a field, where they could see all around them in case wolves decided to try and sneak up, and they rolled out their blankets after dinner and went to sleep, leaving some to take turns watching for animals. The hunter had fallen asleep quickly, content on his bed of furs and blankets. He had dreams of sunny days, perfect for hunting the famed grizzly. He was awoken by the sound of cracking sticks. He found this odd, as they were in a field, but perhaps it was the men rekindling the fire. He peeked out of his tent to check on the encampment. Horror of horrors. There were pools of blood on the ground, but no corpses. He watched as a man, bundled tightly in his blankets, was lifted up by what appeared to be many small moving sticks and carried off towards the edge of the camp. The man woke up from the gentle rocking of his convoy and screamed, alerting the remaining hunters in the camp, who jumped up and reached for their guns. They were quick to draw but were confused by what to fire at, as mostly they just saw sticks on the ground moving in ways that were impossible. They decided to run, because there was nothing clear to shoot at. But as they ran together, they were chased by giant animals that appeared suddenly from the tall grass. The hunter waited until the men were being chased by all the animals, then jumped from his tent and, without looking back when he heard their screams, ran as fast as he could. A week later, he showed up in Nanana, crazed, exhausted, and on the edge of death. He related his story and then perished, for he would constantly wake up screaming if he tried to sleep, and thus could not rest. A version of this story is common in my family, though some details change with the storyteller. My father has seen the stickmen on a hunting trip, and like this apocryphal hunter, he has been crazed and terrorized by the memory ever since. It is said that though the stickmen go by different names and come to people in different shapes, that there is some regularity to their appearance. They generally come as either sticks, which blend in with trees, or the ground, until you come upon them, or they can visit you as an animal. This animal is usually described as either a large deer or a small moose, which can move incredibly quick for how awkward it seems to be hunched on its legs. They appear as pale or white animals, and though they usually do this to intimidate men and women, they are hungry beings who feast on the unwary. Seeing a stick man, one may be haunted for years or their entire life afterwards, but in some cases it is considered good luck, as if a stick man is uninterested with you, it means that you have powerful ancestors surrounding you. You can usually anticipate the arrival of a stick man, as the entire forest will go quiet around you for as long as they are in the vicinity, and sometimes they will speak to you and to each other. When this happens, they sound like a raspy whisper, mixed with the rattling of dry willow branches, a light chattering. Do not camp where the forest is silent, and do not look into the eyes of the stick men, for they will drive you mad with fear. I have never seen these spirits personally, at least. I can't be sure. My only experience with one potentially happened outside of Carson City, Nevada. I was driving alone in a big Ford pickup truck late at night, when I noticed what originally I took to be a deer on the side of the road. This was no deer. It ran like a dog or cat, staying close to the ground in a liquid motion, whereas a deer would bounce or gallop as they ran. It also moved upwards of 30 miles an hour, and when it turned and ran down the hill, I realized it was much larger than almost any deer I'd ever seen, yet lacked antlers. Please, ask your questions if you have, and feel free to share your own experiences below. I am an 18-year-old male from Namibia, Africa. I experienced this in 2016, along with my older sister and girlfriend. It happened during the school holidays as we took a trip to my grandparents' farm. It was one of the places that we loved going to. One morning after having breakfast, my father informed my sister and I to go make a stop at another farmer's farm. He told us that we were to deliver a few farm tools to him that my granddad had supposedly borrowed. My sister perked up when she heard that we would take the car, since the farm was a few kilometers away. My sister and I decided to let my girlfriend tag along, since she still didn't know my family very well. As we were driving along the gravel road, we joked, talked about small things and other crazy stuff, until we reached a road that had trees on either side of it. The trees grew in such a way that they blocked the sun's rays from reaching the gravel road, so we were basically driving under a large shade. I want to let all of you know that I'm very familiar with this part of the road, and I've driven through it many times before, and nothing strange has ever happened. But on this peculiar day, something was off. The birds that usually sang were quiet. Even the wind seemed to be silenced as we drove. By now, we were all quiet and just listening to the gravel beneath the tires of the car. We passed a large tree that had a white mark on its bark, and I dismissed it as I have seen it many times before, and after a few moments I realized that something wasn't right. I checked the time on the radio and it read 2:07. My eyes immediately went wide. We left our farm at 12:30. It never took us long to reach our neighbor. I was a little confused by this. Then my girlfriend said something from the back seat that confused me even more. "Guys, didn't we pass this tree 5 minutes ago?" I looked up, just in time to see us passing the same large tree with the same white mark on its bark. I knew something wasn't right, and I immediately looked at my sister, and she had a frown on her face that I couldn't exactly interpret. "What the hell?" I said out loud. We drove a little more, and we passed the same tree every time, until my sister got angry, and we came to a stop just a few feet away from the same tree. We got out, and were met with a deafening silence. My girlfriend got spooked, got closer to me, and I put an arm around her. "Okay, what the hell is going on around here?" my sister said. "I don't know. We should have been at the guy's farm by now." "We drove past this tree 20 times, my girlfriend said. I'm no stranger to the paranormal. I've had weird experiences before, but nothing ever like this. I was incredibly freaked out, to say the least. As we got into the car again, we saw a red pickup truck drive slowly past us. My sister immediately started the car and closely followed the pickup truck. We drove through the wooded area just a few feet behind it, and after moments, we realized that the environment started to change. I sighed in relief as I saw the dam that was on the right side of the road. We were all glad we got out of there safely. I don't know if this was a loop or a glitch, but it was definitely paranormal. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I know what I experienced that day. We all did. We got home safely without any incident, but we never told our family or anyone else what happened. We have all heard stories of the area of the road being haunted, but I never believed them. After experiencing this, however, I can safely say that my point of view on the matter has changed. When I traveled to India about 20 years ago, I took the bus to travel from one city to another. It was a night bus, so most of the people around me were sleeping. It was dark, and the roads were surrounded by forest out in the middle of nowhere. The road was only illuminated by the headlights of the bus, and we were seemingly alone on the road. I was bored and passed the time by staring out the window. There I saw a creature on the side of the road, hurrying into the dark woods. The moment lasted no more than a second or two, but I saw the creature clearly. It looked like something with a human body doing an inverted crab walk. It had the head of a Doberman dog or jackal, and had a waddling gait, with each limb moving independently like an insect. Everyone around me was asleep, and I felt like I had gone insane. I kept telling myself I must have caught a glimpse of something else and misinterpreted it in my mind. Because I caught a glimpse of it, and later years I questioned whether I was dreaming it. I feel extremely certain of what I saw, but I'm probably wrong. There is probably a logical explanation to it. I'm a very rational person, and do not believe in supernatural things, but being in an Indian forest at night will make even the most sane person doubt their mind. Those forests are truly scary places. I live in rural Australia. One early summer afternoon, I was bushwalking down a big-ass hill, which has a river down at the bottom. From the peak of the hill to the base is about 500 meters. However, the track sort of snakes in back and forth like an S shape, as it's too steep of a hill to just go straight down. About a third of the way down, I spotted a pair of feet from about the ankles down sticking out between some bushes, with the feet running perpendicular to the track. As I got closer, I could see that a man was lying down there, and based on his body position assumed he was resting, and likely homeless and or disoriented, seeking shade from the summer sun, further adding to my theory that he was homeless. He had long hair, a long head, and was wearing track pants, and it was 35 degrees Celsius at least. I got about 100 meters from where I saw the man, and was now on a section of the track, running parallel and below to where he was, now walking in the opposite direction. I had followed a curve on the track S. I saw that this man was suddenly running down. Seeing this unnerved me, as based on his outfit, he did not appear to be a local jogger. As fight or flight began to kick in, I pulled out my inhaler, took a puff, and pretended that I was about to start jogging. I wanted to commit to my act in case I had judged him wrongly, and he was really a local jogger, albeit a poorly dressed one. He continued to run after me along the track, and I was about 2/3 of the way down when I noticed he was running too hard to merely be a jogger. He was running closer to a sprinting pace than a jog, which, as most people know, is a terrible idea when running downhill, let alone in 35+ degree heat, in track pants, and with no visible water bottle. As he gained ground on me, I decided to sit on my ass and slide down the hill, between sections of the track that ran parallel to one another. Once I finally made it to the bottom and across to the other side of the river, I turned and saw he had stopped running. I continued to walk along the river, when after about 5 steps I heard him yell out something obscene. I continued to run on and off until I made my way back to the nearest road, and am yet to return to that track. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friend and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be very rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area, and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time, and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving home until the sun was up. One particular night, we decided to ride a few miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favorite hidden routes. It began with a narrow paved path that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and extremely relaxing to ride through due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, We instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off the path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill, overlooking where we had just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers ride up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers and 2 on fully sized motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. We felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculate who these people could be. Our first thought was they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times we'd been through, and honestly we doubted that this county had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out there. We can see you. Come out." We stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell, "Find them now," and smash a bottle. That had erased any hopes we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and paths. One of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but was too afraid to open my phone in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their furthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and fast as we could through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we could hide again whenever we felt that they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us while basically only being covered in leaves and plants may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the woods onto the intersection of 2 main roads, far from where we had started. We ducked down into the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor, who was supposed to meet up with us after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the 2 streets we were near the corner of, and explained that we needed to be picked up right away. He agreed, and sped over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seats of his car, yelling for him to get the hell out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I felt, being safely driven home after everything I had experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out there, and that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law and taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think we walked right up to a huge drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started and we couldn't see it, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. We'll never really know, I suppose. When I was 13, my mum decided I would be going to military boarding school. It was located north of Mexico in a place called Durango. Durango is known because it is home to many creepy things: drug cartels, the zone of silence, ghost towns, UFO sightings, and the like. I was in that school for around 6 years, and one day a friend invited me and other students to go to his hometown to have some tacos with his dad, a well-known rancher. When we arrived to the town, we were on his house having some drinks, and eventually he decided it was time to go. We hopped into his pickup truck, and he began driving right when the sun was setting. After about half an hour, everything was dark, and he had to turn on the headlights. I was on the front seat with my friend, and we've just arrived to the place. He slowed down his car, and we could hear the nocturnal wildlife and some scratches on the car from branches and plants. The headlights allowed us to see just enough to distinguish shapes. He stopped the car right in front of a little lake, and we could see some bushes and trees around the water. A few meters in front of the right headlight, we could see what we thought was a rock. The guys started unloading the truck while they joked around. My friend and I were still in the front smoking when all of a sudden he said, "Did you see that?" while he pointed to the rock in front of the car with the tip of the cigarette. That just moved. Since I've always wanted to see something paranormal, I remained still. We were both looking at this rock when all of a sudden, the thing turned its head to face us with, I thought, what looked like the face of Gollum. Big, round, yellow eyes and arched back. And I turned to my friend. He grabbed his gun and quickly got out of the car and fired 2 shots into the sky. All of this while people are still unloading the truck and making a fire for the grill and such. I heard a few scream. I saw how this creature looked up to the sky, turned around, and hopped into the water. Right after that, everyone began asking, "What happened?" My friend told us that it was actually a common sight. He explained that his father and grandfather often saw the creature when they were hunting. He said that they called it hombre rana, or frogman. Just a few of the guys saw the thing. We still had the tacos and everything. We were a little creeped out, but we assumed that the frogman was probably more scared of us than we were of him. I saw many terrifying, creepy and odd things in Durango, but the frogman takes the cake. I have been mountain biking since I was 11. It was the only thing that I thought would make me stand out from the crowd, and I was hooked. I moved to a smaller city when I was 15, which was surrounded by mountains and countless wild trails to explore. So I was thrilled when I finally found a riding buddy willing to take the risks. We went out riding all the time. He was born there, so he knew a lot of trails and was very familiar with the suburbs. We lived in a very religious community. Traditions oblige that in a certain month, we have to abstain from eating and drinking anything from sunrise to sunset. Our cycling hobby was no excuse to this tradition. During this month, we limited ourselves to a 30-kilometer ride every 2 days, in order not to cause ourselves physical harm or injury. As we were approaching the city limits returning from a ride, my friend urged me to check out this new trail he had discovered, and despite the exhaustion and dehydration, I obliged. We took a right turn into some woods. The trail was amazing, smooth dirt path, beautiful scenery, and occasional jumps. We were absolutely carried away until the trail disappeared into fresh agricultural soil that was impossible to ride on. We hopped off the bikes to go back to our trail on foot, and as we walked back, I started to think this was a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't have gone too deep into the woods. We were in full mountain bike gear, flashy stuff, and easily noticeable from a distance. My friend was very calm though. We found our trail, and the second I lifted my leg to hop on my bike, some dude grabs my shoulder. 3 guys with dirty clothes, scarred faces, and reeked of BO and cow shit. "What are you doing here?" the older guy starts. I was too scared to speak, and my friend handles these kind of situations better, so he did the talking. They started asking us all kind of questions about our bikes and gear, till one of them laid a hand on my friend's bike and dragging it from him. I remember his exact words. "I'm sorry, but we're taking the bikes." Before we protested, he adds, "Are you fasting today or not?" I answered that we were. "Well, we're not. And if you weren't fasting, we would have taken the bikes and slashed you guys up before sunset." They said it in such a cool and strange tone, and topped it off with, "Stay safe out there." I was in awe. My friend told me he was about to pull out his knife when the guy grabbed his bike. I can only imagine what would have happened. I moved out of that city, picked up motorcycles, and we still ride together and joke about the encounter. I'm grateful it only turned out as badly as it did. I was visiting family in the US when I was a kid. We were on a 3-hour drive in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. I had to take a leak really bad, and my dad eventually pulls the car over so that I could go in the woods. This was about at 11 o'clock in the morning. I went far off to the road into the woods because I didn't want anyone to see me. I wound up being completely out of sight of my family and the road itself. I started urinating next to this large rock and noticed up ahead that there were these 3 figures digging around in the dirt. At first I was like, damn, these people will see me. So I continued to finish without urinating. And as I kept my eye on them, I noticed that they definitely weren't human. They seemed to be in suits, however they also looked naked. You could see they had genitals swinging between their legs. At this point, I ran and quietly slipped away from the rock and back to the road in my family's car. A few years later, I was watching Unsolved Mysteries, and there was an episode that had the classic grey type alien, and it looked exactly like the thing that I saw in the woods. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs and creeks. I've hunted the game, and I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen and smelt about all this region has to offer in way of wilderness. My scariest experience though happened at about 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed, that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between 2 steep ridges. The trail I'm on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in thick underbrush. young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. And that's when I heard a loud crack and froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 4:30 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instincts though. The thought that something flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear it again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not just a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant I had to get the hell out of there. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decently sized wooden stick be violently shaken and whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack and not a thud or thump, and I have described it as explosive in the past as it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now as I stood there completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards. I was going to come to an 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move towards the noise, I was going to have to turn back to it and get up that ridge, and this made me very nervous. My head somewhere between meth fiend murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts big black moving shadows on the trail, and that didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while going up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired, in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out, and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods, I've smelt it all, and I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall and especially leafed out branches make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times, but I just don't know what the hell that was. I live in Russia, and my encounter happened around a year ago in February. I was walking by the embankment at 10 p.m. It was already dark, and nobody was around. There is a road which has 3 levels, a big street. Then it goes down into a smaller one, and finally the embankment, which turns into a small path through thick snow. Just imagine. You're walking through an industrial area which barely has streetlights, no people, and on your left there is a little forest, and on the right there is a river. So I was walking on the path when I saw this man. His whole appearance alarmed me instantly. He had skis on, but was trying to walk as he was without them. In the deep snow, it was around his knee level, and I saw how much effort it took for him not to fall and carry on moving. There was no way to avoid this person, because it was a tiny path through the snow. He was staring at me, smiling. I'm unsure if it was in a predatory way, but something was strange in the smile. I thought, well, if anything happens, I can push him and run, and carry on moving. When I was right next to him, this happened. Everything took place in about 3 seconds. I was watching his every move with my side vision, and in one moment, he vanished. There was nowhere to hide. The trees give you at least 100 meters worth of visibility, and hiding in the snow isn't an option. You would be visible regardless. He was gone. I slightly turned my head to that direction when I captured something right behind me. A stick man. It was absolutely black, around my height, maybe a bit taller, very thin, with a big head and no neck at all. It was standing in a very threatening position, with its arms set apart like an animal preparing to attack. This figure looked like a picture printed straight onto the air. I thought the 2D object should be material at some point, with the thickness of a sheet of paper, for example. But no, this looked entirely different. I turned my head away and started running to the second level of the road. When I got there, I looked back. This thing was peeking out of a tree, and when I spotted it, it hid behind it. At this point, I really thought that I was going to die for sure, and when I got to the third level, some cars were driving by, so it calmed me down a little. I looked back. The stick man was standing in the spot where I was a second ago, right in the middle of the road. The whole landscape looked so unreal that at some point I questioned my sanity. This time, I kept the contact and tried to examine the thing. The stick man was slightly moving back and forth, but its whole body had a very stable dark black figure. I got a feeling. The feeling saying that I shouldn't be seeing this, that my survival instincts were blurring out of my mind, that were telling me to flee. And it was also a feeling like, he's found me. Imagine the feeling when you play hide and seek, and your cousin is very slow finding anyone, so you sit somewhere for 20 minutes. At first, you feel the pleasure from the game, but then as time drags on, you get bored. And when they finally find you, it's almost like a relief. I think that something tried to stop me from walking away, because at some point there was a little desire to approach it. Anyway, it was obvious that it was following me, and the thing is I lived very close to that area. I didn't know what to do, either to wander through the streets so it would lose me, or go directly home. But this thing would know where I lived. I decided to run to safety immediately without looking back. And yes, that wasn't the end. That night, I had sleep paralysis. I remember laying in bed listening to the sound of water from my aquarium when it suddenly stopped. I thought someone was trying to grab my attention, so I opened my eyes, and right next to the bed was the same black figure. This was it, the end of my life. I literally saw my entire existence flash before my eyes. It stood 3 feet away from me, and then it turned in a fog and started to fill my lungs through my nose and throat. When it was entirely inside my body, I awoke, or I didn't sleep at all, I don't know. The thing is, I haven't noticed any difference with myself since. This whole encounter was very different from anything I've seen in my life. There are things you've never experienced before, so you don't actually know what to think or feel, and are filled with curiosity. I am low-key disturbed. Would I one day find myself in the middle of nowhere approaching a random person with the skis on and disappearing next moment? Did that dream mean anything, or was it a dream? I barely remember that man's face. This has been a terribly odd and confusing experience, and if anyone has encountered anything similar, I'd love to hear about it, so that I know I'm not the only one. This story happened to my sister-in-law 4 years ago. They are uber religious, and the state of her mental stability, on top of a finger found and a police follow-up, makes this story 100% true and searchable. Last July, my sister-in-law Jackie was going back to Boise to visit for the weekend. Her husband lives in Provo and is going to law school there, as he's just graduated from a BYU chapter somewhere in southern Idaho. I'm not from Idaho, and I'm not Mormon, so I don't remember where it's located. Anyway, Jackie decided to drive from Provo, Utah, and head up to BYU to say hello to her friends just before coming back to Boise. The route she was on was I-15, which forks off into I-84 up to Boise. After you pass through Salt Lake City, the route becomes lost in a plain rolling flat of miscellaneous desert dotted by farmland here and there. Jackie left Provo, Utah in the evening, as she planned on making dinner for her husband before her departure. She ended up leaving around 11 p.m., and given the late time, she decided to forego visiting her friends at the BYU chapter and headed along I-84 to come straight to Boise. She was in between Tremonton, Utah, and Burley, Idaho, in the literal middle of nowhere, where she drove up to what looked like a body lying in the road. The location is so desolate, there are no radio channels, cell phone services, or lights to be seen for hours. This 24-year-old girl was in the middle of the desert, in a green Dodge car that already had enough problems, so it's a miracle she made it home to us without issue to begin with. She arrived at my wife's parents' house, but that was just the beginning of the story, really. Here is her account of what led to these events. At 2 a.m., she said she saw something lying on the road in the distance. As she approached it, she could see it was a body, lifeless, in the middle of nowhere. It stretched across both lanes, and she could not simply pass without running it over. Cautiously, she came to a stop and made sure she parked about 15 yards away and stopped. She opened the door and yelled, "Are you all right?" But no response could be heard. With the car lights broadcasting brightly on the body in the road, she got out of her car and slowly walked towards the person. As she got about 10 feet from the body in the road, she could see it was a dummy, fully dressed in human clothes, just lying there. Terrified, she sprinted back to her car, slammed on the door, and sped over the dummy. We received the cell phone call from her around Mountain Home, 45 minutes away from Boise. She was shaken and terribly scared, claiming she could hear footsteps chasing her to her car before she got in and drove off. We wrote it off as a freak accident, as we were all asleep and sounded too bizarre to worry of anything. As she pulled into the subdivision, she called us once again to help her unload the car and probably console, given the bizarre experience. I opened the garage door and stood in the driveway with my wife, waiting for her to pull in. She came racing into the driveway and jumped out of the car, and this is where I lost it. As she opened the car door, a finger fell out. She had not stopped and drove straight to us after she came across the dummy. The person who had placed the dummy had chased her back to her car, and as she slammed the door and sped off, the person had reached out, losing a finger in the slammed door. We immediately called the police in the area, where she said she stopped at. The cops did a survey of all the hospitals in the area for a man missing a finger, and they found an exact match of his description. He was still in the hospital as he was arrested. The police did not give any details into the man's past or who he was, just simply told us to not worry about him, as he'd been arrested. I'm sure it's an anticlimactic ending to a terrifying scenario, but I will never forget the feeling that came over me when the finger fell out of her car door. I always drive with a firearm in my vehicle now, any time I need to travel. I went on a midnight walk with my girlfriend. The park by her house has a dirt trail that led up a small mountain. It was about a 30-minute walk to the top, but the view overlooking the city was gorgeous. At the top, the dirt path became paved concrete with a small sitting area. We stayed at the top for about 30 minutes. Upon leaving is where things got creepy. As we started to head back down, at the point where the concrete met dirt path, there was a large pile of trash bags in a crescent shape in the corner of the path's intersection. It was not there when we first arrived. The pile was much too large and in the way for someone who likes to cut corners of paths to notice. My girlfriend remarked at how the shape resembled a dead body and asked me if I had noticed it on the way up. I was very sure that it was not there 30 minutes prior when we arrived. I was extremely sure. Nonetheless, there was no reason to freak my anxiety-prone girlfriend out, so I laughed and said, "Yeah, must have been there, and it was probably trash." Visibility was extremely low, probably about 5 yards, and I didn't want to freak her out, but I was pretty tilted, and I got heckled for being drunk and not listening to her. But in actuality, I was looking and listening for any signs of people around us. In my own head, I was telling myself that I'm just being paranoid, and that it was probably there and I didn't notice it to begin with. But at the same time, I was also sure that it wasn't. I'm sorry I didn't have time to listen to your story about Jesse from work. I'm worried about our safety at the moment. We made it back to our car without running into anyone, but I kind of laughed at myself for being worried about nothing, and also felt the relaxation of my butt muscles that had been clenched for the last half hour. A few days later, the local news covered a dead body found near a park in Anthem at the top of the mountains. Guys, it was actually a dead body. Literally getting chills just saying that. It was actually someone dead. Thank God that my girlfriend didn't watch the news, or she'd have probably shat herself. I've had a lot of strange jobs, but one of the most interesting was working for a tax company based out of Texas. I lived in Kentucky, my home state at the time, but because this company contracted out jobs remotely, I was able to make a very good living for performing tasks which were generally very simple. I had a work partner, and our duty was to travel all over the eastern and central part of the state to county courthouse PVA offices. You might not have those, it's a small town thing, and research delinquent property taxes. We were then required to compile a list of properties who had delinquent taxes and submit it to our boss. She was our primary contact in Texas. This part is important because it was the only reason we would sometimes have to deal with hostile people. The company would then buy the taxes if the property tickled their fancy, and a letter was issued to the owner of the property, stating they had a certain amount of time to repay the amount. I'm not sure what would happen after that, since that isn't part of my job. But I do know that people immediately assumed, because of lack of knowledge or understanding of the law, this company was going to take their property and throw them out on the street. Before the company bought the taxes, however, they would send us back a list of the ones they were interested in, and we would then go out to the location, photograph the property, and then submit all the photos to our Texas contact. This is where things got interesting. It was like the property owners had some kind of psychic intuition about us. They had no idea who we were